Postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism. Introduction. It is safest to grasp the concept of the postmodern as an attempt to think the present historically, in an age that has forgotten how to think historically in the first place. In that case, it either expresses some deeper, irrepressible historical impulse, in however distorted a fashion, or effectively represses and diverts it, depending on the side of the ambiguity you happen to favor. Postmodernism, postmodern consciousness, may then amount to not much more than theorizing its own condition of possibility, which consists primarily in the sheer enumeration of changes and modifications. Modernism also thought compulsively about the new, and tried to watch its coming into being, inventing for that purpose the registering and inscription devices akin to historical time-lapse photography. But the postmodern looks for breaks, for events rather than new worlds, for the telltale instant after which it is no longer the same, for the when it all changed, as Gibson puts it, or better still, for shifts and irrevocable changes in the representation of things and of the way they change. The moderns were interested in what was likely to come of such changes and their general tendency. They thought about the thing itself substantively, in utopian or essential fashion. Postmodernism is more formal in that sense, and more distracted, as Benjamin might put it. It only clocks the variations themselves, and knows only too well that the contents are just more images. In modernism, as I will try to show later on, some residual zones of nature or being, of the old, the older, the archaic, still subsist. Culture can still do something to that nature, and work at transforming that referent. Postmodernism is what you have when the modernization process is complete and nature is gone for good. It is a more fully human world than the older one, but one in which culture has become a veritable second nature. Indeed, what happened to culture may well be one of the more important clues for tracking the postmodern, an immense dilation of its sphere, the sphere of commodities, an immense and historically original acculturation of the real, a quantum leap in what Benjamin still called the aestheticization of reality. He thought it meant fascism, but we know it's only fun, a prodigious exhilaration with the new order of things, a commodity rush, our representations of things tending to arouse an enthusiasm and a mood swing, not necessarily inspired by the things themselves. So, in postmodern culture, culture has become a product in its own right. The market has become a substitute for itself, and fully as much a commodity as any of the items it includes within itself. Modernism was still minimally and tendentially the critique of the commodity and the effort to make it transcend itself. Postmodernism is the consumption of sheer commodification as a process. The lifestyle of the superstate therefore stands in relationship to Marx's fetishism of commodities as the most advanced monotheisms to primitive animisms, or the most rudimentary idol worship. Indeed, any sophisticated theory of the postmodern ought to bear something of the same relationship to Horkheimer and Adorno's old culture-industry concept as MTV or fractal ads bear to 50s television series. Theory has meanwhile itself also changed, and offers its own kind of clue to the mystery. Indeed, one of the more striking features of the postmodern is the way in which, in it, a whole range of tendential analyses of hitherto very different kinds, economic forecasts, marketing studies, culture critiques, new therapies, the generally official Jeremiad about drugs or permissiveness, reviews of art shows or national film festivals, religious revivals or cults, have all coalesced into a new discursive genre, which we might as well call postmodernism theory, and which demands some attention in its own right. It is clearly a class which is a member of its own class, and I would not want to have to decide whether the following chapters are inquiries into the nature of such postmodernism theory, or mere examples of it. I have tried to prevent my own account of postmodernism, which stages a series of semi-autonomous and relatively independent traits or features from conflating back into the one uniquely privileged symptom of a loss of historicity, something that by itself could scarcely connote the presence of the postmodernism in any unerring fashion, as witness peasants, aesthetes, children, liberal economists, or analytic philosophers. But it is hard to discuss postmodernism theory in any general way without having recourse to the matter of historical deafness, an exasperating condition, provided you are aware of it, that determines a series of spasmodic and intermittent but desperate attempts at recuperation. Postmodernism theory is one of those attempts, the effort to take the temperature of the age without instruments, and in a situation in which we are not even sure there is so coherent a thing as an age, or zeitgeist, or system, or current situation any longer. Postmodernism theory is then dialectical, at least insofar as it has the wit to seize on that very uncertainty as its first clue, and to hold to its Ariadne's thread on its way through what may not turn out to be a labyrinth at all, but a gulag, or perhaps a shopping mall. An enormous Claes Oldenburg thermometer, however, as long as a whole city block, might serve as some mysterious symptom of the process, fallen without warning from the sky like a meteorite. For I take it as axiomatic that modernist history is the first casualty and mysterious absence of the postmodernism period. This is essentially Achille Bonito Oliva's version of postmodernism theory. In art, at least, the notion of progress and telos remained alive and well up to very recent times indeed, in its most authentic, least stupid, and caricatural form, in which each genuinely new work unexpectedly, but logically, out-trumped its predecessor. Not linear history, this, but rather Shklovsky's Knight's Gambit, the action at distance, the quantum leap to the undeveloped or underdeveloped square. Dialectical history, to be sure, affirmed that all history worked this way, on its left foot, as it were, progressing, as Henri Lefebvre once put it, by way of catastrophe and disaster, which was on the point of being confirmed as a virtual religious doxa when it unexpectedly vanished without a trace. We went out one morning, and the thermometer was gone. This seems to me a more interesting and plausible story than Lyotard's related one about the end of master narratives, eschatological schemata that were never really narratives in the first place, although I may also have been incautious enough to use the expression from time to time. But it now tells us at least two things about postmodernism theory. First, the theory seems necessarily imperfect or impure. In the present case, owing to the contradiction whereby Oliva's or Lyotard's perception of everything significant about the disappearance of master narratives has itself to be couched in narrative form. Whether, as with Gödel's proof, one can demonstrate the logical impossibility of any internally self-coherent theory of the postmodern, an anti-foundationalism that really eschews all foundations altogether, a non-essentialism without the last shred of an essence in it, is a speculative question. Its empirical answer is that none have so far appeared, all replicating within themselves a mimesis of their own title in the way in which they are parasitary on another system, most often on modernism itself, whose residual traces and unconsciously reproduced values and attitudes then become a precious index to the failure of a whole new culture to come to birth. Despite the delirium of some of its celebrants and apologists, whose euphoria, however, is an interesting historical symptom in its own right, a truly new culture could only emerge through the collective struggle to create a new social system. The constitutive impurity of all postmodernism theory, then, like capital itself, it must be at internal distance from itself, must include the foreign body of alien content, confirms the insight of a periodization that must be insisted on over and over again, namely that postmodernism is not the cultural dominant of a wholly new social order, the rumor about which, under the name of post-industrial society, ran through the media a few years ago, but only the reflex and the concomitant of yet another systemic modification of capitalism itself. No wonder then that shreds of its older avatars, of realism even fully as much as of modernism, live on, to be rewrapped in the luxurious trappings of their putative successor. But this unforeseeable return of narrative as the narrative of the end of narratives, this return of history in the midst of the prognosis of the demise of historical telos, suggests a second feature of postmodernism theory which requires attention, namely, the way in which virtually any observation about the present can be mobilized in the very search for the present itself and pressed into service as a symptom and an index of the deeper logic of the postmodern, which imperceptibly turns into its own theory and the theory of itself. How could it be otherwise, where there no longer exists any such deeper logic for the surface to manifest, and where the symptom has become its own disease, and vice versa, no doubt. But the frenzy whereby virtually anything in the present is appealed to for testimony as to the latter's uniqueness and radical difference from earlier moments of human time does indeed strike one sometimes as harboring a pathology distinctively autoreferential, as though our utter forgetfulness of the past exhausted itself in the vacant but mesmerized contemplation of a schizophrenic present that is incomparable, virtually, by definition. However, as will be demonstrated later on, the decision as to whether one faces a break or a continuity, whether the present is to be seen as a historical originality or as the simple prolongation of more of the same under different sheep's clothing, is not an empirically justifiable or philosophically arguable one, since it is itself the inaugural narrative act that grounds the perception and interpretation of the events to be narrated. In what follows, but for pragmatic reasons I will disclose at the proper time, I have pretended to believe that the postmodern is as unusual as it thinks it is, and that it constitutes a cultural and experiential break worth exploring in greater detail. Nor is this a merely or basely self-fulfilling procedure. Or rather, it may well be that, but such procedures are by no means as frequent occurrences and possibilities as their formula suggests. They thereby themselves, predictably enough, become historical objects of study. For the name itself, postmodernism, has crystallized a host of hitherto independent developments, which, thus named, prove to have contained the thing itself in embryo, and now step forward richly to document its multiple genealogies. It thus turns out that it is not only in love, cratalism, and botany that the supreme act of nomination wields a material impact, and, like lightning striking from the superstructure back to the base, fuses its unlikely materials into a gleaming lump or lava surface. The appeal to experience, otherwise so doubtful and untrustworthy, even though it does really seem as if any number of things had changed, perhaps for good, now recovers a certain authority, as what, in retrospect, the new name allowed you to think you felt, because you now have something to call it that other people seem to acknowledge by themselves using the word. The success story of the word postmodernism demands to be written, no doubt in bestseller format. Such lexical neo-events, in which the coinage of a neologism has all the reality impact of a corporate merger, are among the novelties of media society, which require not merely study, but the establishment of a whole new media lexicological subdiscipline. Why we needed the word postmodernism so long, without knowing it, why a truly motley crew of strange bedfellows ran to embrace it the moment it appeared, are mysteries that will remain unclarified until we have been able to grasp the philosophical and social function of the concept, something impossible in its turn, until we are somehow able to grasp the deeper identity between the two. In the present instance, it seems clear that a range of competing formulations, post-structuralism, post-industrial society, this or that McLuhanite nomenclature, were unsatisfactory insofar as they were too rigidly specified and marked by their area of providence, philosophy, economics, and the media, respectively. However suggestive, therefore, they could not occupy the mediatory position within the various specialized dimensions of post-contemporary life that was required. Postmodern, however, seems to have been able to welcome in the appropriate areas of daily life or the quotidian. Its cultural resonance, appropriately vaster than the merely aesthetic or artistic, distracts suitably from the economic while allowing newer economic materials and innovations in marketing and advertising, for example, but also in business organization, to be recatalogued under the new heading. Nor is the matter of recataloguing and transcoding without its own special kind of significance. The active function, the ethics and the politics of such neologisms lies in the new work they propose of rewriting all the familiar things in new terms and thus proposing modifications, new ideal perspectives, a reshuffling of canonical feelings and values. If postmodernism corresponds to what Raymond Williams meant by his fundamental cultural category, a structure of feeling, and one that has become hegemonic at that, to use another of Williams' crucial categories, then it can only enjoy that status by dint of profound collective self-transformation, a reworking and rewriting of an older system. That ensures novelty and gives intellectuals and ideologues fresh and socially useful tasks, something also marked by the new term with its vague, ominous, or exhilarating promise to get rid of whatever you found confining, unsatisfying, or boring about the modernism, or modernity, however you understand those words. In other words, a very modest or mild apocalypse, the merest sea breeze, that has the additional advantage of having already taken place. But this prodigious rewriting operation, which can lead to whole new perspectives on subjectivity as well as on the object world, has the additional result, already touched on above, that everything is grist for its mill, and that analyses like the one proposed here are easily reabsorbed into the project as a set of usefully unfamiliar transcoding rubrics. The fundamental ideological task of the new concept, however, must remain that of coordinating new forms of practice and social and mental habits. This is finally what I take Williams to have had in mind by the notion of a structure of feeling. With the new forms of economic production and organization thrown up by the modification of capitalism, the new global division of labor, in recent years. It is a relatively small and local version of what I elsewhere try to generalize as cultural revolution, on the scale of the mode of production itself. In the same way, the interrelationship of culture and the economic here is not a one-way street, but a continuous reciprocal interaction and feedback loop. But just as, for Weber, new inner-directed and more ascetic religious values gradually produce new people, capable of thriving in the delayed gratification of the emergent modern labor process, so also the postmodern is to be seen as the production of postmodern people, capable of functioning in a very peculiar socio-economic world indeed, one whose structure and objective features and requirements, if we had a proper account of them, would constitute the situation to which postmodernism is a response, and would give us something a little more decisive than mere postmodernism theory. I have not done that here, of course, and it should be added that culture, in the sense of what cleaves almost too close to the skin of the economic, to be stripped off and inspected in its own right, is itself a postmodern development, not unlike Magritte's shoefoot. Unfortunately, therefore, the infrastructural description I seem to be calling for here is necessarily itself already cultural and a version of postmodernism theory in advance. I have reprinted my program analysis of the postmodern, the cultural logic of late capitalism, without significant modifications, since the attention it received at the time, 1984, lends it the additional interest of a historical document. Other features of the postmodern that have seemed to impose themselves since then are discussed in the conclusion. I have also not modified the sequel, which has been widely reprinted, and which offers a combinatoire of positions on the postmodern, for and against, since while a great many more positions have been taken since then, the lineup remains essentially the same. The more fundamental modification in the situation today involves those who were once able to avoid using the word out of principle. Not many of them are left. The remainder of this volume turns essentially on four themes: interpretation, utopia, survivals of the modern, and returns of the repressed, of historicity, none of which were present in these forms in my original essay. The problem of interpretation is raised by the nature of the new textuality itself, which, when mainly visual, seems to leave no room for interpretation of the older kind, or, when mainly temporal in its total flow, leaves no time for it either. The exhibits here are the video text, as such, and also the nouveau roman, the last significant innovation in the novel, about which I will argue that within the new reconfiguration of the fine arts in postmodernism, it is no longer a very significant form or marker. On the other hand, video can lay some claim to being postmodernism's most distinctive new medium, a medium which, at its best, is a whole new form in itself. Utopia is a spatial matter that might be thought to know a potential change in fortunes in so spatialized a culture as the postmodern. But if this last is as dehistoricized and dehistoricizing, as I sometimes claim here, the synaptic chain that might lead the utopian impulse to expression becomes harder to localize. Utopian representations knew an extraordinary revival in the 1960s. If postmodernism is the substitute for the 60s and the compensation for their political failure, the question of utopia would seem to be a crucial test of what is left of our capacity to imagine change at all. Such, at least, is the question addressed here to one of the most interesting and least characteristic buildings of the postmodern period, Frank Gehry's house in Santa Monica, California. It is also addressed around and behind the visual, as it were, to contemporary photography and installation art. At any rate, utopian in first world postmodernism has become a powerful, left political word rather than its opposite. But if Michael Speaks is right, and there is no pure postmodernism as such, then the residual traces of modernism must be seen in another light, less as anachronisms than as necessary failures that inscribe the particular postmodern project back into its context, while at the same time reopening the question of the modern itself for re-examination. That re-examination will not be undertaken here, but the residuality of the modern and its values, most notably irony in Venturi or de Man, or the questions of totality and representation, offer the occasion for working out one of the assertions of my initial essay that most troubled some readers, namely, the notion that what was variously called post-structuralism, or even simply theory, was also a subvariety of the postmodern, or at least proves to be that in hindsight. Theory, I here prefer the more cumbersome formula theoretical discourse, has seemed unique, if not privileged, among the postmodern arts and genres in its occasional capacity to defy the gravity of the zeitgeist and to produce schools, movements, and even avant-gardes where they are no longer supposed to exist. Two very lengthy and disproportionate chapters examine two of the most successful American theoretical avant-gardes, deconstruction and the new historicism, for traces of their modernity and postmodernity alike. But Simon's old new novel could also be the object of this kind of discrimination, which will not take us very far unless, for the urge to classify objects once and for all in the modern, or the postmodern, or even Jencks's late modern, or other transitional categories, we build a model of the contradictions all these categories stage within the text itself. In any case, this book is not a survey of the postmodern, nor even an introduction to it, always supposing such a thing was possible in the first place, nor are any of its textual exhibits characteristic of the postmodern or prime examples of it, illustrations of its principal features. That has something to do with the qualities of the characteristic, the exemplary, and the illustrative. But it has more to do with the nature of postmodern texts themselves, which is to say, the nature of a text in the first place, since that is a postmodern category and phenomenon which has replaced the older one of a work. Indeed, in one of those extraordinary postmodern mutations where the apocalyptic suddenly turns into the decorative, or at least diminishes abruptly into something you have around the home, Hegel's legendary end of art, the premonitory concept that signaled modernism's supreme anti- or trans-aesthetic vocation to be more than art, or religion either, or even philosophy in some narrow sense, now modestly simmers down into the end of the work of art and the arrival of the text. But this throws the chicken coops of criticism into commotion fully as much as it stirs those of creation. The fundamental disparity and incommensurability between text and work means that to select sample texts and, by analysis, to make them bear the universalizing weight of a representative particular turns them imperceptibly back into that older thing, the work, which is not supposed to exist in the postmodern. This is, as it were, the Heisenberg principle of postmodernism, and the most difficult representational problem for any commentator to come to terms with, save via the endless slideshow, total flow prolonged into the infinite. The same holds true for my penultimate chapter, on some recent films and some recent representations of history of a new and allegorical type. The word nostalgia in my title, however, does not mean what I normally want to make it mean, and I will therefore exceptionally, other objections being dealt with at some length in the concluding section, comment in advance on an expression, nostalgia film, about which I have some misunderstandings to regret. I don't remember any longer whether I am responsible for this term, which still seems to me indispensable, provided you understand that the fashion plate, historicist films it designates, are in no way to be grasped as passionate expressions of that older longing once called nostalgia, but rather quite the opposite. They are a depersonalized visual curiosity and a return of the repressed of the 20s and 30s, without affects. In another place I try to term it nostalgia deco. But one can no more alter a term like this retroactively than substitute some altogether different word for postmodernism itself. The total flow of associative conclusions then takes up, in passing, some of the other inveterate but more serious objections to, or misunderstandings of, my positions, and also comments on politics, demography, nominalism, media, and the image, and other topics which ought to figure in any self-respecting book on the subject. In particular, I have tried to remedy what, rightly, struck some readers as a crucial missing component of the program essay, namely, the absence of any discussion of agency, or the lack of what I prefer to call, following old Plekhanov, any social equivalent for this seemingly disembodied cultural logic. Agency, however, raises the issue of the other unit of my title, Late Capitalism, about which something further needs to be said. In particular, people have begun to notice that it functions as a sign of some kind and seems to carry a burden of intent, and consequences not clear to the non-initiate. It is not my favorite slogan, and I try to vary it with the appropriate synonyms: multinational capitalism, spectacle or image society, media capitalism, the world system, even postmodernism itself. But as the right has also spotted, what evidently seems to them a dangerous new concept and way of speaking, even though some of the economic diagnoses overlap their own, and a term like post-industrial society certainly has a family likeness, this particular terrain of ideological struggle, which unfortunately one rarely chooses oneself, seems a solid one and worth defending. As far as I can see, the general use of the term late capitalism originated with the Frankfurt School. It is everywhere in Adorno and Horkheimer, sometimes varied with their own synonyms, for example, administered society, which make it clear that a very different conception was involved, of a more Weberian type, which, derived essentially from Grossman and Pollock, stressed two essential features. One, a tendential web of bureaucratic control, in its more nightmarish forms, a Foucault-like grid avant la lettre, and two, the interpenetration of government and big business, state capitalism, such that Nazism and the New Deal are related systems, and some form of socialism, benign or Stalinist, also seems on the agenda. As widely used today, the term late capitalism has very different overtones from these. No one particularly notices the expansion of the state sector and bureaucratization any longer. It seems a simple, natural fact of life. What marks the development of the new concept over the older one, which was still roughly consistent with Lenin's notion of a monopoly stage of capitalism, is not merely an emphasis on the emergence of new forms of business organization, multinationals, transnationals, beyond the monopoly stage, but, above all, the vision of a world capitalist system fundamentally distinct from the older imperialism, which was little more than a rivalry between the various colonial powers. The scholastic, I am tempted to say theological, debates on whether the various notions of late capitalism are really consistent with Marxism itself, despite Marx's own repeated evocation in the Grundrisse of the world market as the ultimate horizon of capitalism, turn on this matter of internationalization and how it is to be described, and in particular whether the component of dependency theory or of Wallerstein's world system theory is a production model based on social classes. In spite of these theoretical uncertainties, it seems fair to say that today we have some rough idea of this new system, called late capitalism, in order to mark its continuity with what preceded it, rather than the break, rupture, and mutation that concepts like post-industrial society wish to underscore. Besides the forms of transnational business mentioned above, its features include the new international division of labor, a vertiginous new dynamic in international banking and the stock exchanges, including the enormous second and third world debt, new forms of media interrelationship, very much including transportation systems such as containerization, computers and automation, the flight of production to advanced third world areas, along with all the more familiar social consequences, including the crisis of traditional labor, the emergence of yuppies, and gentrification on a now global scale. In periodizing a phenomenon of this kind, we have to complicate the model with all kinds of supplementary epicycles. It is necessary to distinguish between the gradual setting in place of the various, often unrelated, preconditions for the new structure, and the moment, not exactly chronological, when they all gel and combine into a functional system. This moment is itself less a matter of chronology than it is of a well-nigh Freudian Nachtraglichkeit, or retroactivity. People become aware of the dynamics of some new system, in which they are themselves seized, only later on and gradually. Nor is that dawning collective consciousness of a new system, deduced itself intermittently in a fragmentary way from various unrelated crisis symptoms such as factory closings or higher interest rates, exactly the same as the coming into being of fresh cultural forms of expression. Raymond Williams's structures of feeling do finally strike one as a very odd way to have to characterize postmodernism culturally. That the various preconditions for a new structure of feeling also pre-exist their moment of combination and crystallization into a relatively hegemonic style everyone acknowledges. But that prehistory is not in sync with the economic one. Thus, Mandel suggests that the basic new technological prerequisites of the new long wave of capitalism's third stage, here called late capitalism, were available by the end of World War II, which also had the effect of reorganizing international relations, decolonizing the colonies, and laying the groundwork for the emergence of a new economic world system. Culturally, however, the precondition is to be found, apart from a wide variety of aberrant modernist experiments, which are then restructured in the form of predecessors, in the enormous social and psychological transformations of the 1960s, which swept so much of tradition away on the level of mentalité. Thus, the economic preparation of postmodernism, or late capitalism, began in the 1950s, after the wartime shortages of consumer goods and spare parts had been made up, and new products and new technologies, not least those of the media, could be pioneered. On the other hand, the psychic habitus of the new age demands the absolute break, strengthened by a generational rupture, achieved more properly in the 1960s, it being understood that economic development does not then pause for that, but very much continues along its own level and according to its own logic. If you prefer a now somewhat antiquated language, the distinction is very much the one Althusser used to harp on between a Hegelian essential cross-section of the present, or coupe d'essence, where a culture critique wants to find a single principle of the postmodern inherent in the most varied and ramified features of social life, and that Althusserian structure in dominance, in which the various levels entertain a semi-autonomy over against each other, run at different rates of speed, develop unevenly, and yet conspire to produce a totality. Add to this the unavoidable representational problem that there is no late capitalism in general, but only this or that specific national form of the thing, and non-North American readers will inevitably deplore the Americanocentrism of my own particular account, which is justified only to the degree that it was the brief American century, 45 to 73, that constituted the hothouse, or forcing ground, of the new system, while the development of the cultural forms of postmodernism may be said to be the first specifically North American global style. Meanwhile, it is my sense that both levels in question, infrastructure and superstructures, the economic system and the cultural structure of feeling, somehow crystallized in the great shock of the crises of 1973, the oil crisis, the end of the international gold standard, for all intents and purposes the end of the great wave of wars of national liberation, and the beginning of the end of traditional communism, which, now that the dust clouds have rolled away, disclose the existence, already in place, of a strange new landscape, the landscape the essays in this book try to describe, along with an increasing number of other probes and hypothetical accounts. This matter of periodization is not, however, altogether alien to the signals given off by the expression late capitalism, which is by now clearly identified as a kind of leftist logo, which is ideologically and politically booby-trapped, so that the very act of using it constitutes tacit agreement about a whole range of essentially Marxian social and economic propositions the other side may be far from wanting to endorse. Capitalism was itself always a funny word in this sense. Just using the word, otherwise a neutral enough designation for an economic and social system on whose properties all sides agree, seemed to position you in a vaguely critical, suspicious, if not outright socialist stance. Only committed right-wing ideologues and full-throated market apologists also use it with the same relish. Late capitalism still does some of that, but with a difference. Its qualifier in particular rarely means anything so silly as the ultimate senescence, breakdown, and death of the system as such, a temporal vision that would rather seem to belong to modernism than postmodernism. What late generally conveys is rather the sense that something has changed, that things are different, that we have gone through a transformation of the life world which is somehow decisive, but incomparable with the older convulsions of modernization and industrialization, less perceptible and dramatic somehow, but more permanent, precisely because more thoroughgoing and all-pervasive. That means that the expression late capitalism carries the other, cultural half of my title within it as well. Not only is it something like a literal translation of the other expression, postmodernism, its temporal index seems already to direct attention to changes in the quotidian, and on the cultural level as such. To say that my two terms, the cultural and the economic, thereby collapse back into one another, and say the same thing, in an eclipse of the distinction between base and superstructure that has itself often struck people as significantly characteristic of postmodernism in the first place, is also to suggest that the base, in the third stage of capitalism, generates its superstructures with a new kind of dynamic. And this may also be what, rightly, worries the unconverted about the term. It seems to obligate you in advance to talk about cultural phenomena, at least in business terms, if not in those of political economy. As for postmodernism itself, I have not tried to systematize a usage or to impose any conveniently coherent thumbnail meaning, for the concept is not merely contested, it is also internally conflicted and contradictory. I will argue that, for good or ill, we cannot not use it. But my argument should also be taken to imply that every time it is used, we are under the obligation to rehearse those inner contradictions and to stage those representational inconsistencies and dilemmas. We have to work all that through every time around. Postmodernism is not something we can settle once and for all and then use with a clear conscience. The concept, if there is one, has to come at the end and not at the beginning of our discussions of it. Those are the conditions, the only ones, I think, that prevent the mischief of premature clarification, under which this term can productively continue to be used. The materials assembled in the present volume constitute the third and last section of the penultimate subdivision of a larger project entitled The Poetics of Social Forms. Durham, April 1990.